It was the middle of October, and the small town of Chestnut Hollow was cloaked in the deep, vibrant hues of fall. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves, and the wind whispered secrets through the branches of the old maple trees. For some, this was the most beautiful time of the year. But for Sarah, it was a reminder of the eerie events that had happened the previous fall. Sarah had grown up in Chestnut Hollow, where fall was always marked by the town's harvest festival. It was a time for pumpkin carving, hayrides, and bonfires. Yet, last October, something had changed. A sense of unease had settled over the town, like the chill that crept in after dark. Sarah lived alone in a small, quaint house on the outskirts, where the woods thickened, and the town's noise faded into the rustling of leaves. She loved the solitude, but after what had happened last fall, she had come to dread the onset of autumn. It all began with the whispers. They started as faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind. On her evening walks through the forest trails, she thought she heard voices, soft and low, murmuring through the trees. She would pause, listening, but the whispers always stopped, leaving her standing in silence. One late afternoon, as she was raking leaves in her backyard, she heard them again, closer this time. It was a soft, collective murmur, like many voices speaking at once. She stopped, looking around, but there was no one in sight. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground, the last rays of sun filtering through the red and orange canopy. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response, just the dry rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then, she caught a distinct sound, a low, almost childlike giggle, coming from deeper in the woods. A chill ran down her spine, and she dropped the rake, hurrying back inside and locking the door behind her. She tried to shake it off as her imagination, but the whispers grew louder with each passing day. It was as if the woods around her house had come alive with a presence that watched and waited. One night, unable to sleep, she stood at her window, looking out at the dark silhouette of the trees. The wind howled, and through the sound, she could make out words, a single phrase repeated over and over. "Come play with us." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She backed away from the window, trying to convince herself that it was just a dream. But the next morning, when she went outside, she found something that made her blood run cold. At the edge of the woods, just a few feet from her backyard, lay a pile of leaves shaped into a crude figure, a human form. It was too deliberate, too carefully arranged to be an accident. She stared at it, her mind racing. Was someone playing a trick on her? But who would go through such lengths just to scare her? She told herself it was a prank, but the unease lingered. That night, she locked every window and double-checked the door. But as she lay in bed, she heard the whispers again, this time right outside her window. "Come play with us." She pulled the covers over her head, squeezing her eyes shut, but the voices continued, growing louder until they seemed to fill her entire room. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped, leaving her in a suffocating silence. The next morning, she found another leaf figure in her yard, this one closer to the house. It looked like a child lying on its back, arms stretched out as if reaching for something. Fear clawed at her, and she called the local sheriff, but he dismissed it as kids playing pranks. "Probably some teenagers having fun, you know how they get around this time of year," he said with a shrug. "I'll keep an eye out, but I wouldn't worry too much." But Sarah knew it was more than just a prank. The whispers, the figures, there was something in those woods, something that wanted her to join it. As Halloween approached, the whispers grew more insistent. She stopped going outside altogether, keeping her curtains drawn and lights on. She even stopped sleeping, her nights spent pacing the house, waiting for the voices to return. But despite her precautions, she couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. One night, as the wind howled outside, she heard a sound that froze her in place, a soft, rhythmic tapping on her back door. She grabbed a flashlight and crept down the hall, heart pounding. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear over the wind. And then, through the wood, she heard it, laughter. Childlike, high-pitched, and distorted, like it was coming from deep underwater. She stumbled back, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. "Go away," she shouted, but the laughter only grew louder. Summoning all her courage, she yanked open the door, shining the light outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a figure standing at the edge of her yard, a small child, its face pale and eyes wide, staring directly at her. But there was something wrong with its features, something too sharp, too distorted, as if it were wearing a mask made of skin. The child raised a hand and waved slowly. "Come play with us," it whispered, its voice a raspy echo that seemed to come from all around her. Sarah slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking hands. She backed away, praying that it would go away, that this nightmare would end. But when she turned around, she saw them, figures, pale and shadowy, standing outside every window, peering in at her with eyes that glowed like dying embers. She ran upstairs, barricading herself in her bedroom, but the whispers followed her, seeping through the walls, the floors, the very air she breathed. They grew louder and louder until they became a scream, hundreds of voices shrieking in unison, their words merging into a single, desperate plea. "Join us." She covered her ears, screaming back, but the noise was too overwhelming. It filled her mind, drowning out all thought until she felt like she was being pulled into the darkness, into the cold embrace of the woods. When she woke up, it was morning, and the whispers were gone. She stumbled downstairs, half expecting to find the figures still outside. But the yard was empty, the woods silent. It was as if the entire town had fallen into a deep, unnatural quiet. But then she noticed the trail of leaves leading from her back door into the woods. At the end of the trail, in the same spot where she had seen the figures, lay a new leaf sculpture, a figure curled up on the ground, its arms wrapped around its knees as if trying to protect itself. Sarah recognized the shape immediately. It was her. Terrified, she packed her things and left Chestnut Hollow that very day, vowing never to return. But as she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were watching her, that the whispers were still following her. Now, every fall, when the leaves begin to change and the wind starts to whisper through the trees, she wakes in the middle of the night, expecting to hear those voices again. She knows that one day, they'll call her back to the woods, to finish what they started. Chesterville was a town that most people forgot, a speck on the map surrounded by dense forests and winding, empty roads. It was beautiful during the fall, with the trees exploding into shades of red, orange, and yellow, their leaves carpeting the streets. But for those who had lived there all their lives, fall had a different significance, one that they didn't like to speak about. At the center of all the stories was the old autumn road, a narrow, winding path that cut through the thickest part of the forest. Sarah had heard about it since she was a child, whispered warnings from the older kids, *, stay away from Old Autumn Road at night. That's when the lost come out. Star. As a teenager, she thought it was just another local legend, a story meant to scare kids. But now, as an adult living back in her hometown, she couldn't shake the eerie feeling that settled over her when the leaves started to fall and the days grew shorter. One chilly evening in late October, Sarah's car broke down on her way home from work. To her dismay, she realized she was on the outskirts of town, right near Old Autumn Road. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road, and the air grew colder with each passing minute. Her phone had no signal, and she cursed under her breath, trying to start the engine again. It sputtered and died. With no other option, she wrapped her jacket tighter around herself and decided to walk the mile or so back into town. The forest loomed on either side, the trees creaking in the wind. She kept her head down, focusing on the crunch of leaves beneath her feet, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that she was being watched. About halfway down the road, she heard the sound of leaves rustling behind her. She froze, glancing back, but there was nothing but shadows. She told herself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, and kept walking. But the rustling continued, this time closer. She quickened her pace, her heart thudding in her chest. As she reached a bend in the road, she spotted a figure standing among the trees, a pale, human shape, barely visible in the twilight. It was a man, wearing old-fashioned clothes that looked tattered and faded, like something out of a history book. He stood perfectly still, staring at her with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the fading light. "Hello?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. The man didn't move, didn't respond. He just kept staring. A chill ran down her spine, and she turned away, breaking into a jog. But no matter how far she went, the rustling kept following her, like dry leaves scraping against the ground. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the scent of rotting leaves filled her nose. She glanced over her shoulder again, expecting to see the man. But instead, she saw more figures, men, women, children, all standing among the trees, their faces pale and expressionless, eyes fixed on her. Their clothes were from different eras, some in long, outdated dresses, others in worn-out suits. They began to move, drifting through the trees like shadows, their footsteps silent. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears, and she broke into a full sprint, her breath coming out in panicked gasps. She could hear them behind her, the whispers of their voices rising with the wind. "You shouldn't be here. The lost always find you." She ran faster, her legs burning with the effort, but the figures seemed to close in around her, their voices blending into a low, mournful hum. She could barely see the road through her tears, the forest stretching on endlessly, trapping her in a labyrinth of shadow and decay. Just as she felt she couldn't run any further, she spotted a faint light ahead, the streetlights of Chesterville. With a final burst of energy, she sprinted toward the light, bursting out of the forest and stumbling onto the main road. She collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping for breath, her entire body trembling. When she looked back, the old autumn road was empty. The figures had vanished, leaving nothing behind but the rustling of the leaves in the wind. Sarah limped the rest of the way home, her mind reeling from what she had seen. She told herself it had to be a trick of the light, her mind playing games with her in the fading dusk. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. That night, as she lay in bed, she could still hear the whispers, soft, almost like the rustling of leaves against her window. She tried to ignore them, burying her face in the pillow, but one voice stood out, clear and cold. "You can't escape the lost." Over the next few days, strange things began to happen around her house. She found muddy footprints on her porch, leading up to her door. At night, she would hear tapping at her windows, but whenever she looked outside, there was nothing there. And always, the whispers, murmuring through the walls, growing louder and more insistent. She tried to tell a few friends, but they all laughed it off, saying it was probably just Halloween jitters. But Sarah could see the unease in their eyes, the way they glanced at each other when she mentioned Old Autumn Road. She realized that they knew something that they weren't willing to say. Desperate for answers, she went to the town library and dug through old records, searching for anything about Old Autumn Road. That's when she found the story, an old newspaper clipping from the 1800s. It spoke of a group of settlers who had disappeared during a harsh winter, their bodies never found. Locals began to believe that their spirits wandered the woods, searching for warmth, for life. They called them the lost. Sarah's hands shook as she read the article, her breath catching in her throat. The lost had been known to lure travelers into the woods, taking their place among the living. The whispers, the figures, everything she had experienced matched the stories from the past. As she left the library, the air grew colder, and she caught a glimpse of a familiar figure across the street, a pale man in tattered clothes, his glowing eyes fixed on her. She backed away, her pulse racing, but when she blinked, he was gone. That night, the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling her mind with their desperate plea. She knew then that the lost wouldn't stop until she joined them, until she became one of them. She packed a bag and fled Chesterville, driving away into the night with no destination in mind. But as she sped down the highway, she caught a glimpse in her rearview mirror, figures standing along the roadside, their eyes glowing in the darkness. They followed her, their whispers seeping through the radio, through the rumble of the engine, through her very thoughts. "You can't run forever, Sarah. Now, even miles away from Chesterville, she feels them watching, lurking in the shadows just beyond the reach of the streetlights. She knows they'll find her again, that they'll never stop until she joins them in the woods, among the rustling leaves and the whispering trees. And as the autumn winds howl outside her motel room, she can't help but wonder if this time, she won't make it through the night. Maple Hollow was the kind of town that people usually passed through without a second thought. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, it was a small, tight-knit community, where everyone knew everyone. During the fall, the town looked like something out of a postcard, with its pumpkin patches, scarecrows, and trees ablaze with red and orange leaves. Emily moved to Maple Hollow seeking a quiet life. She had grown up in the city, and the idea of a peaceful, small-town existence seemed idyllic. She bought a little house on the edge of town, right where the woods began, and spent her first few weeks settling in, enjoying the cool, crisp air and the sight of leaves swirling down from the trees. But as October drew on, she began to notice something strange about the town. It wasn't the people, they were friendly enough, always waving as she passed. It wasn't the town's appearance, which was just as charming as the day she arrived. It was more of a feeling, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as if the air grew heavier, more suffocating, especially in the evenings. It started with the sounds. At night, when she sat on her porch with a mug of tea, she would hear whispers drifting through the trees. It wasn't the sound of animals or the wind rustling the leaves, these whispers were low, human-like, carried on the night breeze. Sometimes, they almost sounded like laughter, but distorted, as if a voice was trying to imitate the sound of joy without understanding it. Emily asked around town about the noises, but the locals only gave her vague answers, their smiles tight. They told her it was just the wind, or kids playing pranks, and then quickly changed the subject. She couldn't shake the feeling that they knew more than they were letting on. One particularly cold evening, she decided to take a walk through the woods near her house. She followed a narrow trail lined with fallen leaves, the branches overhead casting long shadows in the fading light. As she ventured deeper into the woods, she came across an old, overgrown path that she had never noticed before. Curiosity got the better of her, and she followed it, the air growing colder with each step. After a few minutes, she found herself standing before a small clearing. At its center was a large, gnarled tree, its bark twisted and blackened, as if it had been struck by lightning years ago. But what caught her attention was the mound of earth beneath the tree, too large and too neat to be natural. She brushed away some of the leaves covering the mound, and her heart stopped. Half buried in the dirt was a faded, old photograph, its edges weathered and torn. It showed a group of people, townsfolk, judging by their old-fashioned clothes, standing in front of what looked like her house. But the thing that chilled her the most was that the people in the photo looked like the ones she had seen in town. Except, they looked exactly the same as they did now. Not older, not different, just the same. Emily pocketed the photograph and hurried back to her house, her mind racing with questions. That night, she tried to look up any old records about Maple Hollow, but found almost nothing. It was as if the town had appeared out of nowhere. The only thing she found was an old, cryptic entry in a forgotten history book, * Maple Hollow, a place where the living and the lost come together. The whispers grew louder that night, pressing against her windows, filling her dreams with strange, disjointed images. She saw the faces of her neighbors, their smiles twisted, their eyes dark hollows. And always, she heard the same words over and over, * stay with us. Stay forever. Emily woke with a start, drenched in sweat, the photograph still clutched in her hand. She decided she couldn't stay in Maple Hollow any longer. She packed her bags and left before sunrise, driving down the winding road that led out of town. But as she reached the edge of the forest, she spotted something in her rearview mirror that made her blood run cold. Figures stood along the side of the road, their faces hidden in shadow, their clothes old and tattered. And in the center of them was the gnarled tree from the clearing, growing impossibly out of the asphalt, its twisted branches reaching toward the sky. Emily pressed her foot to the gas, her car speeding down the road, but the whispers followed her, growing louder and louder, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The next morning, she found herself waking up in her own bed, as if nothing had happened. Her suitcase was unpacked, her belongings neatly arranged as if she had never touched them. Outside, the town was as cheerful as ever, the townsfolk waving and smiling like they always did. But deep down, Emily knew she would never leave. No matter how many times she tried, she always found herself back in Maple Hollow, back in her little house at the edge of the woods, surrounded by the whispers that never stopped. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind blew just right, she could hear the laughter coming from the forest, laughter that wasn't quite human, laughter that echoed through the trees like a distant memory of joy long forgotten. She knew then that she had become part of the town, just like the others. A new face in an old photograph, forever frozen in time. Love these stories? YouTube algorithm suggests that you would like to listen to these stories. Click on the video on the screen.